Imagine a city of 40,000 people, schools, a movie theater, a hospital, an amusement park, a department store with Saturday lines out the door. Now imagine that tomorrow morning, every single one of these people simply vanishes, leaving plates on the table, toys on the floor, textbooks left open mid-page, and clothes in the closets that nobody ever came back for. This isn't a post-apocalyptic movie set or a video game backdrop. This is the reality of dozens of mining towns around the world, from Siberia to Namibia, from Australia to India, from California to an Arctic archipelago beyond the polar circle. A mine gives a town life, and that same mine takes it away. Today we're going to break down 6 real stories. Different continents, different eras, different reasons, but one shared ending. A town built for a single mine is left with no reason to exist. Where do the residents actually go when their jobs, their homes, and their entire reason for living there disappear? Are these towns really as empty as they look in Urban Explorer drone footage? And why do some of them still, right now, as you're watching this video, have people living in them? We'll travel through the Namib Desert, step into a former Soviet camp in Kolyma, peek into the northernmost ghost town on the planet beyond the Arctic Circle, and stop in a place where the ground beneath residents' feet has literally been on fire for over 100 years to understand why these towns die. We first need to understand why they're born at all. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, companies mining coal, diamonds, gold, or copper ran into a simple problem. The deposits were often located where absolutely nobody lived. Deserts, taiga, mountains, the Arctic. The solution was almost always the same. Build a town literally around the mine. Not near an existing settlement, but a brand new one, built from scratch, specifically for the workers and their families. These are called company towns. In them, the company often owned everything. Housing, which the company rented to workers for a symbolic fee. The single store, where groceries were bought with company vouchers. The school, the hospital, the clubhouse, sometimes even the church, all built and maintained by that same enterprise. This created the illusion of total stability. People got lifelong jobs, free housing, a full social package, everything except one thing: real choice. When the deposit ran dry, or the world market price of the resource dropped below the cost of extraction, the company would simply close the mine, and along with it, the entire town's reason for existing. There were no alternative factories to switch to, no other way to earn a living. It was either leave or stay behind in an emptiness with no job, no heating, and no future. It's also worth understanding the economics from the company's side. Building a fully functioning town in the middle of nowhere meant enormous capital costs: roads, water systems, power grids, hospitals. A company took that on only because the projected decades of mining profit comfortably covered those costs. But no company ever intended to maintain a town once the profit dried up. Social infrastructure was always a tool for retaining a workforce, never a goal in itself. And the moment the workforce became unnecessary, the tool was simply switched off. That's exactly why, in most of these cases, the decision about the fate of an entire town wasn't made by the community living there, but by a board of directors thousands of kilometers away, or, as with Kadykchan, a regional official for whom keeping one more heating line running in a subsidized settlement was just a line item easier to cross out of a budget. Now let's walk through 6 specific stories, each illustrating a different possible ending for a one-industry town, from the slowest to the most sudden. 1908 year. A railway worker in the German colony of German Southwest Africa, present-day Namibia, is clearing sand off the tracks and finds a shiny pebble between his fingers. It turns out to be a diamond. Within months, a town called Kolmanskop springs up on that very spot in the Namib Desert. German settlers build it on a scale that seems absurd in the middle of an empty desert. A hospital with the first X-ray machine in the Southern Hemisphere, a ballroom, a casino, a bowling alley, even the continent's first tram. At its peak, around 300 families live here, and almost every one of them has domestic staff. Drinking water is shipped in by train from hundreds of kilometers away, and ice for drinks is imported from Europe. But in the 1920s, far richer diamond deposits are discovered further south. And more importantly, the deposit right next to Kolmanskop is gradually running out. People don't leave all at once. It happens gradually, over decades. First, the casino closes, since there's no one left to gamble. Then the hospital. By the mid-1950s, only a handful of families remain, maintaining what's left of the buildings. In 1956, the last residents leave Kolmanskop for good. And here's something happens that didn't occur in any of the other stories in this video. The desert literally swallows the town. Through broken windows and open doors, the wind carries in sand every single day, gradually filling entire rooms all the way up to the windowsills, the chandeliers, the ceiling. Where did the residents go? The answer here is fairly mundane. They simply followed the company to a new, richer deposit, to the town of Arrangement, which still exists today. The company even moved some of the equipment and furniture to the new site, so for many families the move felt more like a planned relocation than a catastrophe. But not everyone left right away. A few elderly, childless couples who'd grown used to the desert climate stayed in Kolmanskop almost until the very end, simply because they had nowhere to rush off to, and the company kept minimal infrastructure running for a few more years just for their sake. Today, Kolmanskop is one of the most photogenic abandoned towns in the world, an open-air museum that draws tens of thousands of tourists every year to photograph rooms filled with sand up to the ceiling. There's a certain irony in the fact that a town born from a chance discovery in the sand was, in the end, swallowed by that same sand. If Kolmanskop's story is a slow, almost poetic death spread over half a century, this next one is a fast, brutal liquidation carried out in a matter of months. The settlement of Kadykchan in Kolyma, in Russia's Magadan region, was built by Stalin-era labor camp prisoners in the 1940s to mine coal. By the 1990s, over 10,000 people lived there, a completely ordinary Soviet-era industrial town by the standards of the time, with kindergartens, a school, a house of culture, a cinema. In 1996, a methane explosion at the mine kills 6 miners. But the real catastrophe isn't technical, it's economic. In 1990s post-Soviet Russia, Kadykchan's coal simply stops being profitable. The logistics of reaching this remote spot cost more than the coal extracted from it was worth. And then regional authorities make a decision that sounds almost unbelievable to a Western audience. In the dead of winter, the settlement is officially liquidated. Not gradually, by directive from above. Residents are ordered to leave. Heating and electricity are forcibly cut off. People are left with literally no choice. Staying means freezing to death in a home with no heat, at temperatures of -40. Thousands of people are shipped out to other towns in the region, Susaman, Magadan, often into housing nowhere near ready to absorb that many new residents. Some get apartments. Others spend years crammed into temporary dormitories and barracks. The hardest hit were the elderly, people who'd worked the mine for 30 or 40 years and had no other skills for a new life in an unfamiliar town. Many never psychologically recovered. Sociologists who later studied these cases of forced relocation recorded elevated rates of depression, even mortality, among elderly relocates in the first few years after the move. Within a matter of months, Kadykchan goes from a town of 10,000 people to a ghost town. Pianos still stand in abandoned apartments, school notebooks lie scattered on the floor, Soviet-era posters remain on the walls, and in the parking lot, trucks sit with their keys still in the ignition because there was no point hauling them away with the rest of the cargo. Where did the residents of Kadykchan go? They dispersed across other towns in Russia's far east, with no compensation for lost housing, no right to return, and the trauma of forced relocation that many still won't discuss on camera even 30 years later. The settlement itself, abandoned in a matter of weeks, became one of the most frozen in time, abandoned towns in the world, which is exactly why it's become a favorite location for urban explorer vloggers from around the globe. This story is fundamentally different from the previous two. This town wasn't abandoned because a resource ran out, and not because of a state's economic calculations. It was abandoned because the town itself started killing its own residents, and it's still doing so today. Wittenoom, in Western Australia, mined not gold or diamonds, but blue asbestos, a mineral used to make fireproof materials. In the 1940s, 60s, it was one of the largest asbestos deposits in the world, and the town thrived. More than 20,000 people passed through working here over the years. The problem is that blue asbestos is one of the most dangerous forms of asbestos for human health. Microscopic fibers cause mesothelioma, an aggressive cancer that can strike even people with only brief exposure to the dust. Even children, who simply played in the mine's waste piles like a sandbox, a kilometer from the mine itself. The mine closed back in 1966, once extraction became unprofitable. But the real tragedy started later. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, illnesses began being diagnosed one after another among former residents. Not just the miners themselves, but their wives, who washed work clothes at home, and their children, who grew up breathing in the dust every day. The worst part of Wittenoom's story is mesothelioma's so-called latency period. The disease can develop 20, 30, even 40 years after exposure to asbestos dust. That means a person could have lived in the town for only a few childhood years back in the 1950s and receive a terminal diagnosis decades later as an adult with grandchildren of their own, having long since forgotten about Wittenoom. The Australian government made an unprecedented decision, officially de-gazette Wittenoom, strip it of its status as a populated place, remove street names from maps, cut off electricity and water to force the last residents out, and bar any new ones from moving in at all. Today, officially, 1 or 2 residents remain in Wittenoom, still refusing to leave despite the government openly declaring the area unsafe for any habitation whatsoever. Where did everyone else go? Some ended up in cemeteries from asbestos-related illness, decades after they moved away. The rest scattered across Australia, living with lifelong lung monitoring and a constant fear that the diagnosis could catch up with them at any moment, even half a century after they last saw the town. Now, the northernmost story on our list. On the Norwegian Arctic archipelago of Svalbard, just 1,000 kilometers from the North Pole, a Soviet trust built the mining town of Pyramiden in the 1930s, named after the pyramid-shaped mountain nearby. Under an international treaty, the USSR had the right to mine coal here, despite the territory belonging to Norway. At the height of the Cold War, Pyramiden became a showcase of the Soviet way of life, literally its northernmost outpost. It had the world's northernmost heated indoor swimming pool, a gym, a conservatory complete with pianos, greenhouses growing cucumbers beyond the Arctic Circle, and, of course, the world's northernmost statue of Lenin. More than 1,000 people, miners and their families, teachers, doctors, lived here almost completely cut off from the mainland, reachable only by ship for a few months out of the year. But the coal in Pyramiden turned out to be low quality and unprofitable to extract under such extreme conditions. After the collapse of the USSR, the subsidies from Moscow that alone kept the town afloat shrank rapidly. The economics delivered the final blow. In 1998, the trust decided to close the mine entirely. Unlike Kadykchan, there was no frantic winter panic here. The evacuation was carried out in an organized manner, by ship, over the course of several months. People took their personal belongings, but left behind almost all of the public infrastructure: the pianos in the concert hall, the gym equipment, the books in the library, simply because shipping it all across the Arctic Ocean made no economic sense. Interestingly, Pyramiden stood completely unguarded for several years. The town was essentially abandoned in the middle of the Arctic, with polar bears occasionally wandering its empty streets. It wasn't until 2007 that a Norwegian tourism company began organizing official expeditions here, and part of the buildings were preserved to halt further decay. Where did the residents of Pyramiden go? Nearly all of them returned to mainland Russia, mostly to where they'd come from: Murmansk, other mining regions. The town itself has survived in better preserved condition than any other in this video, thanks to the Arctic cold, which simply doesn't let wood rot or metal rust the way it would elsewhere. Today, Pyramiden is an official tourist site, with small groups brought in for open-air tours. And it's probably the only town on this list where the abandoned piano in the concert hall is still almost playable. Our last story takes us back to the 19th century and shows that the phenomenon of the abandoned mining town is far older than every previous example combined. Bodie, California, was born as a typical gold rush town. Gold was discovered here in 1859. And over 20 years the population grew from a handful of prospectors to nearly 10,000 people. It was, by all accounts, a town without rules. Legend has it that gunfights on the streets were an almost daily occurrence, and the number of saloons was counted in the dozens. But gold deposits of this kind run out fast and unpredictably. By the 1880s, the richest veins had been mined out, and the population began shrinking rapidly. First the wealthiest left, then the saloons and shops closed one by one, and the town simply died a natural death, with no single forced order or catastrophe behind it. By the 1940s, only a handful of people remained in Bodie, and by the mid-20th century the town had officially become abandoned. This is, arguably, the most important example on our list, because it illustrates the third and most common scenario in world history for how a one-industry town disappears. Not a disaster, not a forced evacuation, but simply a slow, barely noticeable drain of people chasing new opportunities elsewhere, until there's no one left to keep the school or the store running. Interestingly, some of Bodie's former residents went on to found or resettle other mining towns across California and Nevada, which went through the exact same boom and bust cycle. The gold rush simply kept moving from place to place, and prospector families drifted along with it, never quite settling down for good. Where did Bodie's residents go? They scattered across California over half a century, chasing new gold and silver deposits, and later, following oil and the industrialization of the West Coast. Today, Bodie is an official state historic park, deliberately maintained in a state of arrested decay. Nothing is restored, only preserved as is. So the town still looks exactly as it did the moment the last family drove away. And finally, an example that differs from all the others in the most important way. This isn't a story from the past. It's a story happening right now as you watch this video. Jharia, in India's Jharkhand state, is one of the country's largest coal fields. But underground, a fire has been burning here for over 100 years, since 1916. Underground coal seam fires are practically impossible to extinguish. The fire simply, slowly, devours coal for kilometers beneath the surface, while the ground above it literally collapses and smolders. Hundreds of thousands of people still live in Jharia and the surrounding settlements, largely because there's nowhere to relocate them to, and compensation doesn't reach nearly everyone who needs it. People live literally over a fiery abyss. The ground beneath their homes can give way without warning. Toxic smoke and carbon monoxide rise from the cracks, and in winter, steam sometimes hovers over entire streets in the morning, as if over a geyser. Indian researchers have repeatedly documented cases where a family's house collapsed into the ground overnight, and people quite literally woke up to find the floor beneath their bed cracking open and smoking. Meanwhile, official casualty statistics remain very rough. Nobody systematically tracks the true number of victims of ground collapses and gas poisoning, since a large portion of the population here isn't even officially registered. The government has spent years trying to relocate residents to a purpose-built town called Bulgaria, but the pace of resettlement is extremely slow, and part of the population refuses to move at all, because doing so means losing informal income from gathering coal straight from the surface cracks, which, for all its danger, feeds entire families. Here, the answer to "where did the residents go?" is different from every previous story. For the most part, nowhere. They're still there, over a fire that has been burning for more than a century and, by some estimates, will keep burning for at least another 100 or 200 years. Jharia is, in effect, a live experiment in what happens when a one-industry town is not evacuated in time. The catastrophe simply stretches out across the lifetimes of several generations instead of happening all at once. 6 towns, 5 continents, 5 completely different causes of disappearance: resource depletion, a state-ordered liquidation, environmental poisoning, subsidies drying up, natural population drift, and underground fire. But there's one pattern that repeats every single time. People from mining towns almost never disappear without a trace, the way urban explorer drone footage makes it seem. They always move somewhere, by force or by choice, in an organized way or in a panic. It's just that these moves rarely make it onto camera, because they're nowhere near as cinematic as an abandoned piano in the snow or a house buried in sand up to the windows. The real tragedy of one-industry towns isn't the empty streets. It's that thousands of people who built their entire lives around a single mine are left with no choice the moment that mine closes. No compensation for lost housing. No guarantees at the new destination. Often, no health left, as with the residents of Wittenoom. And sometimes, no right to leave at all, as with the residents of Jharia. A ghost town on video is always a snapshot of the endpoint. The truly interesting story is what happened to the people after the camera was turned off. One more thing ties all 6 stories together. In almost every case, the decision about the fate of thousands of people was made by a small handful of people who never lived there themselves: a board of directors, a regional official, a ministry. Residents of one-industry towns rarely had any real say in whether their town stayed or disappeared. And maybe that's exactly why these towns hold our attention today. In those empty rooms full of abandoned belongings, we're not just looking at the aesthetics of decay. We're looking at silent proof of how fragile a life can be when it's built entirely around a single point on the map. Before we wrap up, a few questions that come up most often in the comments on videos about abandoned towns. Can you actually visit these places? In most cases, yes, but with conditions. Kadykchan is officially open to visitors, though getting there takes a full day over rough terrain. Pyramiden can only be visited as part of an organized group due to Svalbard's visa regime. As for Wittenoom, it's best not to go there at all. Asbestos dust contamination there still exceeds safe limits. Do former residents ever come back to see their old homes? Regularly. For many, it's almost a ritual, coming back every few years, finding their old apartment, photographing whatever's left. Can towns like these come back to life? Theoretically, yes, if a new deposit is found or a new use for the land emerges, which has partially happened with a few old mining settlements that were turned into tourist attractions or even film locations. But fully restoring the population of a town like this has almost never actually happened. If you've ever seen an abandoned mining town in person, or maybe your own relatives live through a forced relocation like the residents of Kadykchan, tell your story in the comments. That's worth far more than any archival record. And if you found it interesting to learn where entire cities actually disappeared to, subscribe to the channel. Because in our What Happened To series, there are dozens more stories waiting for you. Abandoned nuclear towns, forgotten Olympic venues, and islands where the entire population was evacuated in a single day. See you in the next video.